Buenos días en Cuba y en
Good
Estados
morning,
Unidos,
everyone.
en Colombia, en
Cuba,
México
United States, Colombia,
y buenas
Mexico,
tardes en
and
Europa.
good afternoon for ones who are
Realizamos este
listening to us in Europe. We are here in order to share the results of a report that we presented before the United Nations. A report that was also presented before the IACHR on digital surveillance in Cuba, the first comprehensive report on this matter, on digital surveillance in Cuba, as I was mentioning, which is like the big brother figure of Orwell at many levels. So in order to start with the introduction of this report, from the start of Consorcio Justicia and also prisoner defenders, both organizations who were responsible for this report. We're now listening to the words of Mr. Carlos Ponce, the director of Consorcio Justicia, so that he can introduce the report. So whenever you want, Carlos, you have the floor now. Thank you very much, Javier. For us, it's such an honor to work hand in hand with prisoners defenders in order to expose what repression is, the constant repression of the regime in Cuba against their own citizens. For us, is an honor, as I was saying, this report. Why? Because of its quality and also because of its coverage on a matter that wasn't covered during many years throughout different investigations. This process opens the door to United Nations and talks about the freedom of association and assembly. They are actually developing a global report on this same matter, how regimes surveil, prosecute activists and don't let organizations to work, reviewing and surveilling constantly social networks. And this is a golden opportunity so that a report of the special rapporteur can have this information, which is the result of over 200 interviews in Cuba, in the island. So legal analysis as well, the legal bases that exist in Cuba and which allow the regime to have an stability. There's a legal analysis on surveillance patterns. Patterns on live surveillance are also included. And also the insights from the victim's perspective, including over 80 to 90% of respondents who actually say that they were prosecuted, that the Cuban government restricts their access to social networks. The government doesn't allow them to exercise the right to activism and the rights of association and assembly. So this report is a unique report complementing all of the reports that we already have from the side of prisoners defenders. A great work from their side to expose what's going on in Cuba so that the whole world can work hand in hand and can see exactly what happens and fight against it. This report is available in different languages and it's unique. Why? Because this report contains the legal base and the legal grounds, so to say, of people who have been suffering this kind of persecution, so that international bodies like the United Nations can have the information, up-to-date information. regarding what's going on in Cuba. So thank you very much for being here, for listening to us, what you did hand in hand with us. So Javier, back to you.
Muchas gracias
Thank you,
por la
Carlos.
introducción
Thank you
y
for your
paso
introduction.
a Karen
Let's move
Herrera,
on. Now,
que nos va a
Miss
explicar
Karen
sobre
Herrera, Legal Director of Prisoner
el
Defender, has the floor
Contacte
now in order to
relativa
introduce
a
the
las
study
conexiones.
that
Karen, cuando
was
quieras.
held. So, thank you. Good afternoon, good morning. It's an honor to be here to be part of this event. As Carlos was saying, this report exposes that surveillance, digital surveillance, it's an articulated system with different tools, digital tools, legal frameworks, and also police procedures. So neutralization and the control of behavior are also included. So surveillance, it's not only about the virtual space, but also the daily life of Cubans, the family environment, and also people who actually live abroad. So first things first, we would like to review the profile of people who actually responded. So the the 13% of people live abroad, and over 80% of the respondents stated in the first person, as we are actually sharing. So profiles are quite different: activists, Protestants, family members of political prisoners, journalists, and also citizens who are not linked to activism, so that we can have a sample of the whole population. Taking into account the patterns that Carlos mentioned, let's start with the systematic monitoring of social networks. And you can see in screen 76.5% of respondents actually saw that other people shared messages and were used by authorities during interrogations. So statements reveal the following. It's not an abstract or generic information because 57.5% of respondents said that authorities showed them screenshots of their communications, and a 47% received comments, explicit comments, on the matter that they were actually surveilled in social networks. This means that they don't suspect what's going on. Authorities use and file digital content that Cubans, citizens, post in order to prosecute them. One of the worst data is that it doesn't limit to public information. So 42% says that they were shown during interrogations private messages, for instance. And they also say that these communications are held in private groups. Users say that these groups are intimate, protected, but it's quite far from reality. Let's go to the next pattern. We talk about an anomaly in the access to internet. It's applied selectively, especially when it comes to political tension. As we can see on the screen, only 5% of the respondents said that they didn't suffer any kind of anomaly. This means 95% of respondents experimented some kind of interference or in their connectivity. So we can actually say that there weren't any kind of failures here. So practices like internet outages, cuts of websites, of mobile data. But you can see all the detailed information in the report. These data are key. Why? Because we can see a degradation which is actually intentional on the internet service. The 44.5% responded said that they had social networks blockages, for instance, in Facebook or X. People also say, respondents also say that they couldn't access websites without an VPN. So we can see that the information is being controlled by the government. One of the key elements is the timing. 71% of the respondents said that these cuts or outages occurred during symbolic protests like the 1st of May or the International Day of Human Rights. So we can see here that they are not random events, they are linked to some activist events. Let's move to the next pattern. We see digital intrusion. 49.5% respondents received some warnings when someone tried to enter into accounts. 46.5% detected some unauthorized password changes. This indicates that we are not before technical failures, but a digital intrusion. So the direct link to access personal data. 65.5% responded said that they access to the mobile phones or that they had to disblock their enter to their device during interrogations. This shows us that private communications in Cuba are unprotected. So there is a digital surveillance without any kind of legal permission, violating the right of expression, among other rights, of course. Let's come to the physical surveillance. We see the following. There is a material consequence, immediate consequence. After posting something, participating on debates, which are, of course, both public and private, the 84% respondents say that they suffered some digital surveillance. So this means that outside of the virtual world, they also suffer the consequences in the real world, in the non-digital world. It's systematic, it's diversified, and based on intimidation. So the 55% respondents say that they received some kind of authorized visit at their homes, surveillance before the houses. And also, 40% of respondents said that this kind of people follow them on different vehicles. Digital control is also using usually legal provisions. It's systematic, they are based on legal matters in order to access private messages, private or public debates, communications. Out of these communications, the 58% received warnings when they were linked to certain people who had a dissident profile. 56% of people were actually threatened with legal or administrative threats, which means that the vast majority have to face legal consequences. What about the offline repressions? We can say that there's a systematic link between the digital activity and the real life activity. So out of these 200 respondents, over 60% of respondents had to were summoned actually before the authorities, and 61% of respondents said that they were interrogated at work or at home. This confirms that the digital surveillance actives somehow cycle a digital and a surveillance offline as well. This is quite concerning. Also, when it comes to the retraction of devices and also money mobile. So theft of credit and property, which were at an amount of 3,000 pesos, Cuban pesos. Of course, this amount is sampled significantly for a Cuban citizen. As I was saying, it's a theft of credit and it's also a form of political repression. What about repression against family members and close associates? Well, we see that this doesn't happen only to the person who express or exercises the freedom of expression, but also on their family members. We can see the detailed data on the report. The 66.5% of the respondents, which means 133 people, said that their family members were threatened. There's another 50% of respondents said that they were threatened by authorities, which demonstrates that repression in Cuba is not a matter of individual case, but also collective. So it's mostly the direct family members, as we can see the data on screen, so partners, mothers, siblings, sons, daughters. These people didn't actually carry out any kind of activist or protest. What about the transnational surveillance? It's not a direct surveillance against the person abroad, but the family members who stayed and remained in Cuba, as we can see on screen, for instance, due to posts or publishing outside of Cuba. As we can see, this is incompatible with the standards of human rights, international human rights. We can also say that this digital gap isn't actually a failure, but a tool of control. So the low quality on the service, for instance, shows a monopoly on the telecommunication services. We can see that the 80% of respondents say that their access to internet is way too expensive in order to make it regular. Or over the 60% said that they have problems accessing internet. So we can see that access to internet is, of course, unstable and unequal as well. What about the self-censorship and also the withdrawal from the digital world? We can see that measures like the physical surveillance, digital surveillance, and if we bear in mind all of these patterns, it's not only visible, but they have a self-deterrent effect. So a deterrent effect, which means that people withdraw from the digital world. So the main conclusion is, if I will face some legal consequences due to my freedom of expression of what I post or whatever, then I'm not doing that. So this self-censorship is also another pattern we actually included in our report. What about the fears depending on the channel? We also expose it clearly on this report, on this study. So 160 people out of this 200 respondents say that they have a high fear on the main social networks. So this is not outside of the legal framework. It's actually protected by the legal provisions. So, for instance, the Decree Law 370 Penal Code, for instance, paves the way to carry out this digital surveillance and this surveillance in general in order to violate the freedom of expression. So there's recommendations for the Cuban government and also international community. But we should say that our recommendations are quite clear. For instance, restoring the quality of access to internet for people. And you can see more details on the report, of course. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you for your comprehensive review and oversight. 53 pages are the pages found on this report. So, who else can actually talk us about this information rather than the victims themselves? One of them is here with us today, a journalist, ABC journalist in Cuba, and she's also a journalist in Cubanet. So, Camila Costa, we admire you totally. And of course, you'll be sharing with us today your perspective regarding the digital surveillance. So, whenever you want, you have the floor. Thank you, Javier, for inviting me here and letting me share my thoughts on this. You were talking about the victims, right? Well, I'm an independent journalist since 2019. I'm here in La Habana and I listened to the whole presentation of the report. I've been a victim on every pattern that you mentioned. I remember the first time that I experienced this interrogation that was back in 2020, March 2020. And I was fined. That was 3,000 pesos, Cuban pesos, which is around $120, which is quite excessive if we bear in mind the salaries in Cuba, of course. And they also took my phone away, my working devices. During many months, many journalists experienced this kind of interrogations. We started a campaign against this 370 decree law. We talked about these patterns, these surveillance patterns, and we tried to take all the data information before international bodies on this framework. Thousands of fined people back then. Nevertheless, it's not only about fines due to what you post or what you don't post on the internet. They were prisoners. They are prisoners. So people who remain in prison because of what they posted some months ago in Las Tunas province. So prosecutors required for several years of prisons for 8 people who post some propaganda, as the authorities said that it was. The penal code, constitution. So, regardless if it's stated in the constitution that we have the freedom of expression, everything is linked to and it depends on the interpretation, on trials, judges who can exercise this repression. It's not about, as I was saying, the fines, but also the digital surveillance that authorities in Cuba exercise. So we need to start doing some kind of espionage in order to say out loud and complain, report that they are violating our rights. For instance, we buy mobile lines on behalf of other people, with the name of other people, just to access internet and in order to report or denounce from the very island what's going on. Cyber bullying, cyber surveillance, and also discredit of what's going on. So this trolls army, which is working for the government, for state, and they're using it only to discredit us on this framework, especially on social networks. We saw that the situation escalated throughout the years. Some years ago, we saw only like the access of internet, the widespread of internet that was back in 2018. And they had to widespread the surveillance to social networks in a space where Cubans were able to express on that virtual world what was going on, something that they couldn't do or weren't able to do so in the streets, in the physical world. It was prohibited to express our thoughts in the streets, so the social networks, the virtual world was the safe space for Cubans. Cuban regime had to widespread the repression to social networks, and we saw that the legislation, legal procedures focused on cutting and violating our expression, our freedoms in the digital world. They took what happened on the streets into the digital world in order to maintain their power. So thank you very much for this opportunity, for letting me speak out loud. I would like to thank prisoner defenders for reporting and also denouncing this kind of aggressions that we experiment on the virtual world as well due to our work. Thank you very much, Camila. You made it clear. And when you speak about political prisoners, I would like to tell you that you're right. Dozens of prisoners in Cuba who sit nowadays in prison, they are condemned, they are sanctioned due to different surveillance and digital surveillance and posting that was against the government or what they think. So it's about do not post anything more. And if you do so, the decree law 370 is exercised, and this could mean that you would sit 2 years in prison. There are also many people who sit in prison due to what they posted on social networks, also because social networks worked as a way of reporting what they're saying or what they're expressing. There's like a delay on the audios, so I forgot to say something. I would like to mention it now. And the 11th of July, I remember that in my criminal file presented to the authorities, I saw that I posted some tweets regarding the protests that were going on these days, and that was like the main hint or the main proof or evidence they had in order to prosecute me. So this is a great example to see how they think, how they act. Indeed, Camila. So let's move on to another victim, two other victims who suffered recently the repression and digital surveillance and the physical surveillance generated by this digital surveillance are two people with us, José Silva, José Díaz Silva, líder of the Movimiento Democracia, Movimiento Opositores por una Nueva República. Quite important when it comes to carrying out this study, because he helped us to disseminate the form of declaration so that we were able to be in contact with hundreds of respondents. So Javier, whenever you want, you have the floor. Let us know about your experience. I think you're muted. There you go. Hi there, also José Daniel Ferreira would like to say hi because we both suffer these patterns that the tyranny uses, not only against activists, but also against Cuban citizens, normal ones. I'm not only a victim, but my family members, friends, activists of human rights organizations, which actually have many statements regarding this matter. We are aware that the 100% of the Cuban population is being surveilled in the digital world. So they use these tools. The regime uses these tools on these situations. Camila was actually mentioning real things. But the regime uses patterns like threatening and deterring not only our friends, our family members, but the direct family members. They use the same mobile lines The same phones, they intrude into the phone so that the mother, the father, the siblings talk, so that they can interrogate that other person. It's something that we see on the detention, on the arrests that they were carried out recently. The state security, they arrest a Cuban citizen, and throughout their device, they sent a message, a private message to a family member, so that this family member talks and responds, and then use this as an evidence against this person. So we are victims here. Victims of what Camila mentioned, of what you mentioned. We were victims of these patterns, but we reported it. We denounced it against the prosecutors, the army prosecutors, the state prosecutors, and we gathered all the information on months, on documents, and never, and I repeat that, never did we get any kind of response. There's a case I saw back in 2009, we were in front of a prison. We tried to stop the procedures because back then they used our devices. We were arrested. They took our phones away, and they looked into our notes. They took these documents, these notes that we wrote for ourselves, and they took this kind of documents to the prosecutors. And this is the evidence they used for us to end up sitting in prison. Another campaign with 15 photos, 20 photos that they were stolen from our devices, from our mobile phones. Every time a Cuban was arrested and ended at the police department, they tried to blackmail us so that we confess that we were carrying out any kind of crime only because we were sharing some photo from family member or friends. This is the pattern the regime used. So this kind of thefts show us the objective of the regime. The regime says that the money that you have comes from the enemies. So they are entitled to steal your credit. For instance, I have photos, I have images, I have also demands on repressors, on people who were arrested, and I was sent threats. I was threatened by officials. An official threatened me, and of course I'm using my case as an example, but that's the reality of many Cubans. So what I'm saying here is that the regime uses this kind of patterns in order to make your family members, your friends guilty, to blame your close associates for what you did. So as you can see, Javier, there are many Cubans who state this kind of reality. A pattern used by the state control against Cubans. They don't defend and they don't protect human rights, and they go against Cuban citizens. Thank you very much for your statement. So 200 respondents are included in our study, and many of them are not linked to political activity. Nevertheless, they suffer this kind of repression anyway. One of the people, of the persons with the highest digital surveillance and physical surveillance as well, which is abominable, especially when it comes to the cameras. uh, in front of their house is the José Arias Ferrer, activist, a leader of the Oposición Democrática Cubana. He's quite experienced, worked for freedom, for democracy. So, José Daniel Ferrer, when you want, you can share your thoughts on this matter. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to say hi to all of you. And of course, thank prisoners defenders' work, especially when it comes to sharing information on this monitoring on information, what happens with the prisoners in Cuba. This kind of reports helps international bodies like United Nations to understand the magnitude. It's key to our fight, to our strive, and also in order to nurture the Cuban population. So you were saying during many years we were victims of surveillance, theft. I'm actually, well, I hold a record. I couldn't have a mobile line, and I even lost five mobile lines that were actually with under my name. They stole everything from my house because they couldn't find a mobile line, and whenever I was freed or released, I was told that this mobile phone line was blockage. It was sold to some other customer, and I couldn't have a mobile phone of my own. Back in the day, I had like 15 mobile lines that I rotated throughout neighbors so that I could have signal. I couldn't have a phone at home because it was blocked. Or whenever I reached my home, I lost the access to my phone. So I had to use the help of many people, of many partners, and I wanted to share my experience on this matter because many people now suffer this kind of situations, still the attacks, the monitoring, while political police is carrying out, and above all, internet outages, internet shortcuts, cuts, sorry. At some point, I even had to enter the house of a neighbor in order to access internet and that I could have access to a signal so that I could use WhatsApp, among other applications, receive information or search for information. Information that I needed immediately in order to know the situation on in Cuba and of course in other parts of the world. I ratify everything you mentioned. I confirm that the vast majority of activists and independent journalists suffer this kind of attacks. And we need to look for alternatives. So denouncing, demanding, reporting is key, of course, is paramount, but that's not the only step we should take. We must look for alternatives, mechanism that maybe, I don't know, maybe they're not available nowadays, but sometimes we had some wireless communications so that our communication could reach the point we needed, so that we could circumvent the surveillance carried out by the regime. What happened on the 11th of July 2021? After this date, after what happened in Iran, the protests against the regime and the internet cuts leads us to think again that we should ask and demand from the United States and all the states, of course, but the United States defend freedom of expression. And what happens is that many international bodies are actually allies of the regime. So we need to ask this kind of countries to have access to the internet. if my internet is cut, one of the last experience or cuts that I experienced, and there wasn't any kind of demonstration, because of course, when we carry out a demonstration, internet access is cut. But I remember that from January until April, an international agency visited us. The Reuters journalist didn't come yet, and there was no internet access around us. So half of Santiago didn't have access to internet, so that they couldn't be information online, live, or any kind of live works that Reuters could carry out. This is only an example. But sometimes we even take advantage of these kind of cuts because we knew exactly when they would come to at home. For instance, we have the alarm at 4 a.m. My wife and I, even if we slept 2 hours, the first thing that sounded was the alarm, and we took our phones, we sent a WhatsApp message. I sent it to my wife or my wife to me so that we could see if we had internet access, and we see the LTE, and that was only a trap. So it appeared that we had an internet access, but we actually didn't, and it was the first step of an attack, an assault that we suffered at home, as if we were terrorists in the Middle East, and the army, the American army, would have to act against us. So army men with guns who pointed at me. But at 4 a.m., we sent each other a message, and we saw that we didn't have internet access. We started moving so that we could hide everything that we could hide back in the day, let alone that when we wanted to take care of the media, we spent 1 hour at night hiding information, hiding things that we had, and afterwards another hour in order to retrieve this mobile phone or a laptop. In a country where tyranny prosecutes this kind of acts as if it was, I don't know, coke, drugs, or nuclear weapons. So this is the situation that we live in Cuba. This is the reason why I highlight that it is needed, it is paramount to look for alternatives and to take out the policemen that we have inside. In a Cuban citizen, there are many Cubans inside of them. What I mean by that is that we know exactly that we are being surveilled. There are many applications that cannot be controlled that we can use in our advantage. Many applications that are configured in our phones so that family members attract, friends attract abroad, even in Germany, in the United States, with a number abroad. And they can attract these kind of things. Because if someone from abroad saw that, the report would be incredible. So report is quite positive. Circumventing the patterns, their mechanism is so necessary as the report. Otherwise, we couldn't democratize Cuba. Thank you very much, José Daniel. This level of censorship, wow. You're talking about human rights activists, but the fear of Cuban population only because of their WhatsApp communications, social networks communications. WhatsApp is safe, right? But you experience this panic, and international journalists, when trying to communicate with Cuban victims, they say that they don't receive any kind of answers. So we always deliver some recommendations so that these international journalists receive answers from Cubans. Nevertheless, there's a permanent mental panic. And in order to complement these insights, these comprehensive insights on digital surveillance, some minutes ago, Orlando Gutierrez was here with us, but I don't see whether he's connected or not, but Javier Nart is also here with us. Javier, it seems that your image is actually rotated, so maybe if you could rotate your image again towards your left side. Let's try that out. So could you please rotate your phone, your device? There you go. There you go. How are you doing, Javier? Mr. Javier Nart is an MP of the European Parliament. He's the most active MP in many Latin American countries, also Nicaragua. His knowledge, implication with human rights by elected victims. He was also a war correspondent. He's a very loved person in Spain. Quite experienced. So Javier, you have the floor now. We listen to the statements of some of the victims. You can see what study is about. You know its details, of course, because you're in contact, you're in touch with many victims. So what are your insights? There is a surveillance in Cuba, extraordinary way. Especially for what we just listened, there's a double repression, the evident repression of the other persons, and also the self-censorship, which is based on the fear. When it comes about thinking that people can enter into your devices, this is common in many totalitarian regimes and brutal regimes. I have a reference, a person like George Orwell in 1984, his work made a future projection because, well, it wasn't so accurate because technology nowadays is even greater than back in the day when Orwell thought about it. But the main point here is how evident it is that instead of investing in needed infrastructure, the regime does other things. For instance, electric infrastructure, the electric system fell down. In Cuba, for instance, the Soviet Union received $65,000 before, the Berlin Wall fall and everything, and they invested these dollars in order to create a dignified life. Nevertheless, Cuba is suffering a collapse, economic collapse, apart from the fear before the regime. What helped the island was the tourism on one hand, and that fell as well by 25%. Solidarity missions abroad, Javier Larrondo fired it, exemplary, stating that what we all thought it was solidarity, it was actually an economic slavery form. We see a high amount of resources dedicated to have espionage, spynet, in order to control the way of thinking, the mindsets of the Cuban citizens. What for? To remain at the power. I have a certainty. It's not feasible. The regime is not feasible. Venezuela leads as an example in many matters. So capacity on self-defense is quite low, as we could see on this country, but also in Cuba. So surgical extirpation of the United States. But with this operation, we saw the strategic control on Venezuela, a neocolonialism way of controlling population, and we saw this hero values that Noriega also had in Panama. This made the Cuban regime think. So, Diaz-Canel, political presence, he doesn't control much, but this structure, Gaeta's structure, army, political structure, people who actually have the strategic control on Cuba, on one hand, on the military side, but also the economic side, on the other hand. Nevertheless, they must see that they're coming to an end. The feasibility of their economic methods, deaths, lives, I don't care what they say, the words that they use. That motto of the Cuban Revolution, which is like nonsense. In the end, it means, what about my money? What about my benefits? So coming back, I wouldn't want to do a detour. So the Cuban government doesn't want to maintain an opposition to the regime. I admire the Cuban population because they keep on fighting for freedom. This is only my thoughts. We're actually, I totally recall, and that's only my humble opinion, that we are coming to an end on this regime. The regime is not feasible. They don't have the petrol resources, let alone the touristic resources. So in the end, at the end of the day, what they have is the Gaisa complex. They must understand that this is coming to an end and they can't control a country only by repression. So it's like a bomb that will explode. So I'm always feeling this solidarity for the Cuban population. And I think I showed this every time I had the opportunity for. But I wish for other people what I wish for myself as well. I want freedom for myself, so I wish freedom. I wish that the Cuba population has freedom anyway. Sorry for coughing.
Pocas personas, te aseguro, Javier, y tú lo sabes porque te lo digo y te lo he dicho.
Not many people, Javier, as I told you before already. Not many people I've known that weren't born in Cuba were so supportive and have this solidarity feeling like you do. It was you who actually took the initiatives to CAO, and we're doing this, we're doing that. So I totally admire your work, what you did, especially if people are from the left wing and if the word itself it's still decent, they should lead by example. A left-wing person from the 21st century should be able to defend, preserve, and safeguard human rights in every part of the world, regardless if it benefits you or not. So thank you very much, Javier. I don't know if I'm allowed to do a comment, but I would like to say hi to Javier and also to let you know, Javier, that I'm quite grateful for your solidarity. This solidarity always helped political prisoners, democratic goals, and also me and my family members. Thank you very much. I hope we can see,
Dios quiera.
well, I can see you in La Habana on site,
Bueno, y sin
face to
más,
face.
creo que Orlando ha tenido que salir porque tenía
It seems that Orlando couldn't be here with us today.
y ya no le tenemos con nosotros. Voy a dar paso a
So let's move on.
algunas preguntas que tengo aquí apuntadas.
There are some questions. One of them is Juan Carlos Espinosa from the F agency. So the question is for José Daniel Ferrer after action, so it has kind of an introduction with a conclusion. Nevertheless, at the end, we have the question. So after the actions of the United States in Venezuela and the decision of maintaining the Chavism in the power so that their economic interests are protected, and of course, being unable to maintain the stability, are you concerned about what this means to the opposition in Cuba in the case of Trump acting in the island with similar activity, maintaining the tyranny in exchange of economic concessions? So what do you think? So first things first, I would like to greet the agency and greet you, of course. Even if all of the powers have, economic drivers, the United States follow a positive plan, under my humble opinion, which will help Venezuela to retrieve their democracy, which will pave the way for Venezuelan citizens to maintain or retrieve their democracy. This is exactly what has to be done when a regime like the Chavez regime, and even if we have evidence on the drugs crime, in a world where many people talk, but not many people do and carry out actions, when measures have to be taken, when we need to condemn different tyrannies like in Cuba. So, do I think that that could happen to Cuba, where there's a transition period and the regime doesn't have another option, as Rodriguez has, to move in a way that it's stated by the United States? I think that it will be the Cuban population who actually will try to defend their rights. And I wish that the European Union wakes up and instead of being an ally to Putin, to the Russian regime, a regime that wants to be power from the very territory until Portugal, I truly hope that we are the protagonists, the main characters of this transition. But if this doesn't happen, and I'm given the option to see how destroyed Cuban is, repressed is by a tyranny, by a regime allied to Iran, China, Russia, and this other action, like what the United States did, in order to take this tyranny out of the power and give Cubans again their fundamental rights, then I would have to choose this second option. Ideally, we ourselves, Cubans, would be the ones retrieving democracy, a democracy we are worthwhile. That would be only ideally. Nevertheless, politics is what we can do and not what we dream of. So that Venezuela, this transition they're going on a path, they're on the right track, and they're going under a path which is quite positive for them. Indeed,
se puede ampliar
I
mucho,
totally agree with you.
porque a veces damos por sentado cosas que no lo son. Entre otras cosas, porque es diferente.
And we could also see the details on what you say. We can see a change on a country, and it's not the same seeing this situation as a victim and having family members in prison, sitting in prisons, than when you're only abroad and you see the news and that's it. Recently, I was in an embassy, and a Spanish diplomat said, medium level, we are concerned. Why? Because what United States can do, what could happen? My answer was like, well, the Venezuelan population has hope now. Why? Because they were victims. That was after Maduro was arrested. Before Maduro was arrested. And what I said is, if the United States take Maduro away and put him in prison, that would be great. But from abroad, every little thing that could make them feel nervous, make them forget about the victims, forget their sufferings, because they've never suffered like victims do. So we should always see things from the victim's perspective, not from a comfortable perspective. That happens also for revolutionaries who actually defend revolution from Europe, using this quote like, until the last revolutionary, only if it's Cuban. Okay? We want to be here, we want to demonstrate from Europe with the big bills, and that's it. But if someone has to die, that would be the Cubans. We see that actually we were quite punctual, we're on time, we already launched reports to politicians, bodies, so on and so forth. The first comprehensive report on digital surveillance in Cuba is already sent, is already attached. So we encourage every media outlet to read this report, not because of us, prisoners defenders, but because of victims, so that everyone knows exactly what the big brother of Orwell is and what happens, how they're using this big brother in Cuba, what's going on in Cuba. Thank you very much, Jose Diaz Silva, Ferrer, Orlando as well, who was with us until a minute ago. Camila Costa, thank you very much. Javier Nart, Karen as well, great work. Congratulations, and let's keep on with the good work. Viva Cuba Libre.